Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for attending this lecture at the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs with 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak with any of our staff members who are present today at the conclusion of the event. Now about our speaker. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Daniel Peon, who is currently a professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he teaches graduate courses on energy economics and conflict. He is also a global fellow at the Wilson Center and an advisor for the U.S. government. He was previously the chief economist at the U.S. Department of State, where he advised the secretary and senior principals on a wide range of international economic and security topics relevant to U.S. foreign policy, including global macroeconomic growth, financial stability and economic sanctions, counter-terrorist financing, international trade, and energy security. Prior to public service, Dr. An was the chief economist for commodities at Citigroup in New York, and also held senior positions at Citadel, Barclays Capital, and Lehman Brothers. He has also held research and teaching positions at Harvard University, the National Bureau of Economic Research, Columbia University, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the International Monetary Fund. He is the author of multiple research articles, congressional testimony, and a forthcoming economics textbook. He was featured in Forbes magazine as one of 30 under 30 in finance. He completed his AB in economics and finance with honors from Princeton University and his PhD in economics from Harvard University. Welcome, Dr. An.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for a real wonderful introduction, and thank you to IWP for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for coming to listen to me talk for the next hour or so. So what I thought I would do today is go through some slides for about half an hour, and then leave the remaining time open for questions and answers. We really would enjoy having a discussion with everyone in the room. What I'll be talking about today is some work that I actually began at the State Department, hence the background, and sort of continued on in an academic capacity about using new big data and machine learning techniques to understand the economics of targeted sanctions, this new tool of economic statecraft and warfare. Just a quick disclaimer, everything that I say today are my personal views and not necessarily the views of the US State Department or the US government. Okay. Sanctions have actually been around for a very long time. Perhaps the first recorded incident, at least in Western history, dates all the way back to 432 BC and the Megarian decree, where Athens imposed sanctions upon the city-state of Megara for its pro-Sparta stance. And if you believe Thucydides, this actually was the trigger, not obviously the underlying hidden cause, but the trigger that unleashed the Peloponnesian War. And of course, since then, there have been many instances of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy since, whether it is UN sanctions against Iraq, North Korea, or US sanctions against Cuba, etc. But all of those generally fell into the category of what are called broad or comprehensive sanctions. These are broad trade embargo style sanctions against an entire country. What's been occurring much more recently is a new phase in the history of sanctions, namely the usage of targeted sanctions, also sometimes known as smart sanctions, that instead of sanctioning an entire country, only sanctions specific individuals or specific companies and entities, or even specific transactions. And what I'll be talking about today is how to think about the economics of this new kind of sanctions tool. And in particular, what I'll be discussing today our main case study are the US and EU targeted sanctions program against primarily Russian targets in response to the annexation of Crimea and, of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. From the perspective of a social scientist, this is actually what's called a nice natural experiment because unlike targeted sanctions programs against North Korea or Iran, etc., the sanctions program against Russia has been purely targeted in nature and not part of a broader comprehensive sanctions program simultaneously. Even then, there are still considerable challenges to trying to understand what the economic impact of targeted sanctions have been in the Russia case. Notably, the Russian economy was being impacted by large macroeconomic and sector-level shocks that were more or less contemporaneous with the targeted sanctions program. Targeted sanctions against Russia began in March and April of 2014, but later that year there was a dramatic fall in the price of oil. That had nothing to do with sanctions per se, but obviously had a very big impact upon the Russian economy. So, as an economist, the challenge is how to disentangle between the impact coming from sanctions and the impact coming from the fall in the price of oil and other things that were contemporaneous with the sanctions, but not driven by the sanctions. Of course, people have tried to sort of disentangle that impact, and there's like studies, for example, at the IMF and the World Bank, etc., that have tried to do macroeconomic simulations of Russia, understand what the impact would have been based on the fall in the price of oil, and then study that and compare that to what actually happened to the Russian economy, and then said, well, we think this might be the impact of sanctions. But going back to what I was saying earlier, the very nature of sanctions has changed. And again, these new forms of targeted sanctions are not macroeconomic and macroscopic in nature. They are microeconomic in nature. They focus against specific individuals and entities. And therefore, what I would argue is that requires a very different methodological approach using not macroeconomic data, but microeconomic data to understand the impact. So the study, and I should have mentioned at the beginning that this is joint work with my good colleague and co-author, Rod Ludema of Georgetown University. This is, we believe, one of the first studies that is actually using detailed firm and individual level networked big data to actually study the impact on the real economic health and financial performance of the targets at that micro level. And this includes not just publicly traded firms, but privately held firms as well, firms that are not directly sanctioned but are indirectly sanctioned because they are linked to a sanctioned individual, and also subsidiaries of directly sanctioned firms that also indirectly face sanctions because they are significant. They have a significant ownership in the subsidiary firm. The data in particular comes from two sources. I won't go into terrible detail, but one is called the Bureau van Dijk Orbis database, which is actually now part of Moody's. The other is the LexisNexis World Compliance database that tracks a lot of individuals and their relationships to firms. And I'm not going to get into this here, but we use some machine learning, AI sort of techniques to try and merge these databases together to get a fuller, comprehensive picture forensically of what is happening to both sanctioned firms and non-sanctioned firms. Happy to discuss offline to anyone who wants to dig deeper into that. So from the larger database that was actually tracking about 18 million firms, we isolated around 81,000 firms that include about 500 or so firms that were, again, sanctioned, and another 2,500 or so firms that are indirectly sanctioned because they are subsidiaries of the explicitly sanctioned firms. And the remainder is a control group that we created by taking all of the other firms that share the same business sector as the sanctioned firms but are not sanctioned. The idea of this control group is similar to like a pharmaceutical drug trial, where you have a treatment group of people that get the treatment of a prototype drug, and a control group of people who just get placebos. And what we're trying to do here is to isolate out the difference between the performance of the treatment group versus the control group to isolate that impact of the sanctions. What in particular we are tracking is various measures of financial performance like revenue, total asset holdings, number of employees. We also can track whether the firm is active or has gone into some non-active status, like they've gone bankrupt or liquidated, where the company is located and what sector the company operates in. This is just a quick histogram tracking just how many individuals, entities have been sanctioned. This is just a timeline that shows the incidence of sanctions, with the blue being sanctions from the US and red being sanctions from the European Union. But really there are, kind of broadly speaking, three general categories to sanctions. So there are, I think I'm allowed to move this way, there are what are called blocking sanctions upon entities. And so there is an entity that is explicitly sanctioned, which means that no US person and or EU person is allowed to do any kind of economic transaction with that entity. And then also subsidiaries of that explicitly sanctioned entity also implicitly face the same sanctions. And then there are sanctions upon individuals, and therefore there are companies in which the individual has an economic interest in that also, therefore, transactions are prohibited with the West. And lastly, there are sectoral sanctions, which is a little bit, the name is a little bit misleading. It's not sanctions against an entire sector. It is still sanctions against specific companies, but they happen to be companies that are in certain key sectors of the Russian economy. And there, these are milder sanctions where only some kinds of transactions are allowed, mostly around short-term financing, but longer-term financing, certain unconventional technologies, those are prohibited with these sectorally sanctioned targets. So those are the three big categories of sanctions. Where are these sanctions located? Well, not surprisingly, much of them are in Russia, but actually a considerable number are not in Russia. They are in Ukraine, in Cyprus, in Finland, in Switzerland, etc. This is just a Venn diagram that shows the amount of US blocked entities versus EU blocked entities. You can see the overlap in between. Here is the Venn diagram that shows the overlap between US sanctioned individuals versus EU sanctioned individuals. And we divided them into two categories. One are individuals that did not seem to have any economic relationship with a firm, at least according to our database. So these are, broadly speaking, purely political figures. And the below hemisphere, which are individuals that do have an economic relationship with a firm. So you can stereotypically think of people above as being, for example, members of the Crimean Duma or a militia leader, and people below being business figures and oligarchs. And that, in turn, creates a Venn diagram of the number of firms that are linked to those sanctioned individuals. And so here are the firms that are linked to US sanctioned individuals versus EU sanctioned individuals. And this is finally the Venn diagram of the overlap between US versus EU sectorally sanctioned companies. Okay. Now, as we started exploring the data, we noticed something interesting. So, as one might expect, the financial health of a lot of the firms were declining, and that is not surprising again because Russia was hit with a major recession around the same time. But some Russian firms that were actually sanctioned seemed not to be moving in the trend downward, but were either flat or even outperforming, and seeing big improvements in their financial health. And so, as we explored deeper to understand why this was so, we gathered a lot of anecdotal evidence that these firms were the recipients of government largesse and subsidies. That those subsidies can come in a variety of forms. They can come in the form of the granting of government contracts, or state-backed loan guarantees, direct capital injections by the state, tax breaks, etc. The specific mechanism by which they are, as we're calling them, shielded by the state may vary, but they are, again, being protected. And that needs to be controlled for when understanding and isolating the impact of sanctions, right? Because you don't want to contaminate the measurement of the impact of sanctions by including those firms that were sanctioned but then also shielded by the state. So what we had to do, but before that, let me just give you a couple examples of firms that, again, we have strong reason to believe got shielded. So BKB Bank is one. This is actually my favorite example. Bank Russia, which was one of the first banks to be sanctioned by the West. It's known as the private bank of Russia's political leadership. You can sort of see the dates down here. This is from the Moscow Times. So exactly 1 month after it got sanctioned, the Russian government announces that Bank Russia is the new bank responsible for managing Russia's wholesale electricity market. And that comes with it the equivalent of several $100 million in revenue every year. So that effectively doubled Bank Russia's revenue. And but Bank Russia had very little experience in actually managing wholesale electricity markets, and therefore had to hire the previous bank as a contractor to actually do the work of servicing Russia's electricity market. And the day after Bank Russia receives this government contract, Russia announces that it will start opening commercial operations in Crimea, which the leadership themselves have said this is not commercially viable necessarily, but we will do it out of solidarity with the regime. So there seems to be some underlying relationship between some of these firms that are getting bailouts from the state and the political leadership. The final example is Almas Ante is a big defense contractor that, of course, among other things, develops and manufactures the surface-to-air missile system that one of which brought down MH17. So how to control for this shielding effect? We can't just ex post take all of the firms that seem not to move along the trend and then say we think that those are shielded. We need to figure out some ex ante objective and systematic way of determining which firms are likely to get shielded and which firms don't. And what we did, therefore, is we constructed a list of what we call strategic firms by combining 3 lists that are actually constructed by the government of Russia. The first is a list of firms that the Russian government deems of, quote, strategic importance for national defense and state security. The second is a list of systemic or backbone firms, which have a, quote, significant effect on the formation of GDP, employment, and social stability. And last, a list of systemically important financial institutions, according to the central bank. And many, although not all firms, which anecdotally we have heard have become shielded, appear on one or more of these lists. So it's not a perfect measure of predicting state shielding, but as I will show you in a moment, it actually still seems to, it seems to work. And here's the Venn diagram of the different types of strategic firms. Okay, I'm not going to get into all of the math here, but really let me try and explain the intuition of what we're trying to do. So again, the analogy is to a pharmaceutical drug trial. We have the universe of all Russian firms, again, mostly Russian firms, and let's just say that here is higher financial performance and lower financial performance. Well, a lot of these firms will be going down thanks to the general recession in Russia. Right? But what we do is we compare not the general decline in financial performance of a sanctioned firm, here in red, but we compute the relative performance difference between a sanctioned firm and peers that operate in the same sector as the sanctioned firm. So for example, if there's a sanctioned Russian energy company, we are comparing the performance of that sanctioned Russian energy company to non-sanctioned Russian energy companies. So all of those energy companies, of course, will decline as the price of oil fell, but by computing the additional decline of the sanctioned Russian energy company relative to non-sanctioned Russian energy companies, we are able to isolate the sanction-specific effect while controlling for the broader sectoral energy effect. That's the heart of the statistical intuition behind what we're trying to do. And what do we find? Let's get to the actual results. We find that targeted sanctions indeed do have a very big and statistically significant negative impact upon their targets. They're converting the numbers back into intuition. We calculate that there is about a 3% higher probability of bankruptcy, a 1/4 decline in revenue, a 1/2 decline in asset holdings, and a 1/3 decline in number of employees. These are very, very big numbers, and again, very statistically robust. And if you add up together all of the impacts of the impact upon revenue of the firms, and you aggregate them all up together, that comes to something around 1.4% of GDP, which is actually quite consistent with some of the macroeconomic simulation models that were done previously by economists. But again, I would argue that the right way to do this is not using macroeconomic data, but using microeconomic data. However, once we condition upon whether that firm is strategic or not, the story becomes very different. If a strategic firm gets sanctioned, then there is no impact upon the probability of bankruptcy, and there is no impact upon revenue. There is still an impact upon asset valuation, and there is an impact upon number of employees, but the magnitude of that is halved compared to the impact on non-strategic sanctioned firms. So sanctioned but strategic firms are systematically outperforming non-strategic sanctioned firms. And this is actually pretty new. We also try to understand the mechanisms by which the sanctions are actually impacting the firms. And initially we figured if a firm is operating in a sector that is highly dependent upon Western intermediate inputs, that should have a high impact upon that firm, right? Because the way sanctions are actually working, of course, is by disconnecting those trading relationships with the West, and so any Russian firm that was dependent upon imports to the West or exports to the West, those firms that are more dependent should be more severely impacted. by sanctions. But it turns out that just looking at the gross dependence upon the sector that the targeted firm is operating in does not have any statistical relationship with the magnitude of the impact. So gross dependency upon Western inputs doesn't seem to be the right way to look at this. But if you actually look at how much that sector is dependent not upon gross Western inputs, but Western service inputs, so technology, financing, those kinds of service inputs, that has a very powerful effect upon the magnitude of the impact. So if you are a firm that is highly dependent upon Western services as part of your value chain, you are going to be very impacted. While if you're just dependent upon the West for some, let's say, manufacturing part, you can probably find substitutes and mitigate that impact. So that seems to be the primary channel by which these sanctions are actually working. Okay, now moving on a little bit to policy, and I have 2 minutes left. It's been interesting to study how there's almost an institutional arms race that is now occurring between the sanctioning technology as implemented by the US and the EU and others, and the counter-sanctions or anti-sanctions shielding technology and administrative capacity being developed by targets. So I kind of note that Russia is creating institutional capacity to try and, again, shield and mitigate certain sectors of their economy from sanctions. So what are some of the policy implications from this statistical analysis? So broadly speaking, the targeted sanctions, sometimes known as smart sanctions, because the analogy is to like a smart precision-guided bomb that's supposed to just hit the target with relatively little collateral damage. That does seem to be living up to its name. And there does seem to be a concentrated economic impact upon the targeted firm relative to their non-targeted peers. But as we discussed, I didn't have enough time to discuss entirely today, but it was fleshed out fully in the paper. We do find some evidence of spillover onto non-targeted firms as well. So there does seem to be some spillover, and that does seem to suggest that as smart as they are, targeted sanctions could be smarter. Also, we find that the targeted government shields, again, certain strategic targets. This is not a free lunch. At first, when we saw this, we were a little nonplussed and felt, well, great. We target the U.S. targets a sanctioned firm, but then the host government just rides to its rescue and bails out that firm. Then what's the point of sanctions? It's actually more nuanced than that, because that bailout doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the state. And the state has to divert resources to shield these strategic targets from the full brunt of sanction impact. And if you actually calculate roughly how much minimum the Russian government needed to bail out these strategic targets, it comes to a conservative estimate of at least $13 billion US. Okay? So not a huge number, but not an insignificant number, I would argue either. And again, what the shielding is doing is it's transmuting the economic harm away from the tactical target of the sanctioned firm itself, and instead onto the strategic target of the regime itself. And the regime needs to come up with the resources to do that bailout, right? And that regime may mean the regime no longer has the resources to do something else that the regime otherwise would have done. Or it may mean that the regime in turn decides to divert resources from, say, the general public by raiding the pension fund of the general public. So in a very narrow sense, perhaps, now understanding this phenomenon of shielding, a critic might argue that targeted sanctions and comprehensive sanctions, there's no difference. Because, again, targeted sanctions were supposed to be targeting the target, and that was supposed to be better than a comprehensive sanctions approach of targeting the country and targeting the general public, right? And a critic might say, well, if you sanction a target, but then the regime decides to move resources away from the general public onto the target, then the ultimate pain is being borne by the general public. And so there's no difference between that and comprehensive sanctions. I would push back against that criticism, because clearly, at the very least, what is happening is you are still constraining the options available to the regime. The regime has to make a decision whether to shield the target or not. And the agency, who is actually responsible for the pain upon the general public, is, in this case, the regime that is making an active decision to take resources away from the general public and onto and shift it onto that strategic sanctioned target. So there is a very interesting soft power almost component to sanctions that needs to happen, whereby the general public needs to understand again that it is not the West that is responsible for the impact being moving on to the general public, but rather it is their government's decision to divert resources from their own pensions to bail out this strategic target. And actually, and this gets into this broader question of what exactly are sanctions for in the first place, and I think there is there needs to be a more nuanced and fuller understanding of the objectives of sanctions. If the objective of sanctions is just to hurt the tactically damage and economically constrain the tactical target, then I would say that our research suggests that does work, conditional upon the regime not deciding to shield that target. So all else equal, yes, tactically targeted sanctions work. But if you actually believe that the sanctions is not about constraining the target, but instead trying to motivate and incentivize an underlying change in regime behavior, then that's a very different objective. That is a strategic objective, not a tactical objective. And there, we only are doing one case study here, so and understanding and whether sanctions are working from a strategic context is very difficult to understand, because we have to consider a hypothetical of what they would have done without sanctions. But I would argue that what we have shown here is some interesting evidence that when we sanction a strategic target, somehow that is making the regime uncomfortable enough that it is deciding to actively divert resources to shield that. And in doing so is moving the pain onto itself. And therefore, if the point of sanctions is actually just to increase the amount of discomfort to the regime, shielding is actually a good thing. And you want to shield strategic targets with the full intention of forcing the regime to bail them out. And then finally, sort of have some thoughts about spillover and whether that's a good or a bad thing. I would argue that that is not a good thing. Some people might say, well, if there's spillover impacts, that's a good thing because that is increasing the overall magnitude of the economic impact upon the economy. But I think that's too simplistic a view. The spillover effects is an unintended consequence of the sanctions. If you are just trying to increase the impact overall, you can always sanction more targets. And actually, from, again, this perspective of trying to change regime behavior, if this spillover impact is sticky, and it's just causing general de-risking and general disconnection of business relationships that will not come back as easily when sanctions are lifted. That is actually weakening the incentive of the sanctioned target to change its behavior in the first place. Because if it thinks, even if I change my behavior, all of this spillover and de-risking has occurred, and that's still going to be there, even if the sanctions have formally rolled off, then what incentive do I have to change my behavior in the first place? So I think that's another interesting policy area. So just to wrap up, broadly speaking, again, I hope I have convinced you that in this new era of targeted or smart sanctions, it requires a radically different statistical approach and data approach that has to embrace big data, new micro data, and machine learning and AI and all of that. In some ongoing research, we are doing some other stuff around understanding ownership structures and the creation of shell companies. But there is also this emerging policy linkage between the efficacy of targeted sanctions and the broader kind of efforts at AML, tax evasion, financial transparency. It is with those same tools that these targeted sanctions are actually having an impact. So I'm 7 minutes over time, but it could have been worse. Thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to your questions and comments. Do I call on people, or do other people? Well, why don't we call on people? So, yes, sir.
All right. Dr. thank you very much. My name is Connor Clark. I'm a grad student at University of Maryland. So I was wondering, I guess based on, it's a two-part question. Are you concerned that, say, knowing that even with your argument with the Russian government being a main factor of agency here, is there a sort of concern that this is going to wind up in an RT headline that says, U.S. State Department declares sanctions have zero strategic effect, we're hurting a bunch of pensioners? And is there anything you can do with the State Department to try and mitigate against just handing over a propaganda victory? My second question is also, if you are thinking about the stickiness of response, and the difference between a strategic firm and maybe thinking about another firm and the pain really transferring or transmuting, in your words, to the regime. If there's a firm that, say, isn't deeply strategic but is owned by Putin's son-in-law or something, is that an effective way to transfer pain onto the regime, knowing, okay, they didn't have anything to do with shooting down MH17, but we know Moscow will be irked if they have to bail out the president's son-in-law's, bank. Is that a reasonable policy implication, and would that have some sort of desired effect? Again, I know that's a two-part question, so take them in whichever order you like.
Okay, yeah, both excellent questions, and I'm going to sort of defer to the actual experts on like messaging and communication and media engagement. Of course, we have the new U.S. Agency for Global Media to effectively communicate what is actually going on. But again, I would just simply say that we are understanding this, what is actually happening using this big data sets, and it seems to be suggesting that it's more complicated than just simply having a big impact upon the targets. And the most effective policy response is not just sort of resting on our laurels saying target sanctions work and leaving it at that, but having a more multidimensional strategy that would involve not just Treasury and State, but the Agency for Global Media or all of the other tools of both hard and soft power available to U.S. policymakers to get the right message across and to prevent this rally around the flag effect. On your second question, is it better to sort of go against
Those firms
maybe
with
not
the most
strategic.
political pull that
Right,
you
right.
know will get bailed out, or can be predict with high confidence will get bailed out just to poke at the regime.
Right. So again, trying to have an objective and credible quantitative measure of the strategicness of a firm and how likely it is that it's going to get bailed out by the regime is very challenging, especially in Russia. We try to do the best we can using publicly available information. We again found these lists of firms that the government of Russia has actually said that these are strategically important to us, that they will get priority access to state aid in some cases. But yeah, there's that more amorphous strategic nature of some firms. And again, I mentioned during my presentation that not all the firms that we anecdotally believe to have gotten shielded appear on those lists, right? It's going to require, I would say, good judgment on the part of our policymakers and good intel, frankly, to actually understand which are targets actually worth sanctioning and what the and not just from a shield, whether it'll shield or not, but also the kind of downstream effects that will occur from sanctions. I'm sort of thinking of the Deripaska Rusal sort of sanctions right now as a test case on how we need to think about the full secondary and knock-on effects of sanctions upon our value chains and so on. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Ron, I just appreciate your presentation. I thought your economic analysis was excellent, especially on target sanctions and differentiating them from the grand view. My question was, what microeconomic behavior of the firms or individuals actually warrants for targeted sanctions to be applied in the first place? You talked a lot about your analysis with big data, but you didn't talk about the assumption behind the model.
So I think there's actually two parts to that question. So first, which firms or which entities and individuals actually get sanctioned? Well, that is set by either the executive orders, which grant the authorities to Treasury and state and other agencies to actually sanction them, and those have to do with I don't exactly remember the exact language, but undermining the democratic processes in Ukraine, enabling again the occupation of Crimea, a lot of foreign policy reasons, because again, this is at the end of the day a tool of U.S. foreign policy and national security. So there is a set of legal criteria that these targets need to meet, and all of the targets are carefully vetted by U.S. officials and I'm sure their European counterparts to ensure that they meet the right kind of criteria to actually be sanctioned. And that actually touches a bit on your second question, which was what are the assumptions that underlie this analysis? Well, a key assumption is actually that we are not biasing our results by having the treatment group of sanctioned firms be systematically underperforming non-sanctioned firms purely out of coincidence, right? So, for example, if it just so happened that the sanctioned firms were all underperforming because of some other reason, like for example, because they are all energy companies or something like that, or that they are all, say, big companies, and since all the sanctioned firms, hypothetically, if all of the sanctioned firms were big firms, and big firms just happen to grow slower and perform weaker than small firms, then you're introducing bias into the analysis by by measuring what seems to be the sanctions effect is actually being caused by something else, right? So a key assumption is that there's no underlying economic criteria by which a firm may get sanctioned. And that gets back to this, again, the foreign policy criteria or selection process, right? And in the fuller paper, we do a battery of statistical robustness checks to see whether we have inadvertently introduced bias into our results. I'm happy to say that all the robustness checks seem to show all green. There does not seem to be a statistical bias, even though, yes, on average, sanctioned firms tend to be bigger than non-sanctioned firms. But by then comparing a sanctioned firm not with the entire group of non-sanctioned peer firms, but just comparing it with the non-sanctioned peer firm that is closest to it in size, so of similar size, the effect is still there, for example. So we are pretty confident that we have truly isolated a sanctions effect. Let me just go down in turn. So, yes, no, yes, sir, in the blue jacket.
Me?
Yes.
So my question is going back to the same controls that you use in your model. So one control that's come to my mind like is that now I haven't seen in the paper that you control for the ownership. So my question goes for the assumption of the you said it's experimental, right? So that you use defended. But the thing is that like I can see like how it's going to be experimental, like reason like so when the U.S. government is going to target the firm should have some kind of ownership, like governments should have some kind of stock in that firm, has going to have some ownership should be kind of related to the entities that they're going to be sanctioned, right? So I'm trying to see how you say that it's experimental data. Like this is something that I miss in the paper, and like I see that you said that it's going to be in the further work, but how are you going to control for it so the result not being biased?
I think I kind of understand the question. So, in terms of ownership and whether that might be introducing bias into our results, well, one check that we did try was, again, a number of these sanctioned firms are state-owned firms. So we tried, ultimately owned by some part of the Russian government. You might have reason to believe that firms that are owned by the government directly, there's a different incentive by which the government regime might react to that sanction. It turns out that controlling for whether a firm is state-owned or not doesn't seem to have any bearing upon our results beyond the strategic nature of the firm. So beyond controlling for whether that firm is strategic or not, whether that firm is owned by the government or not doesn't seem to have very much of an impact. So we are, again, confident that it's robust to that. But again, in sort of ongoing work, what I'm trying to do is to understand how the firm's ownership structures may be changing in response to sanctions in an effort to basically avoid and evade sanctions. Again, that's sort of why I said it sort of gets into this broader policy around tax evasion and anti-money laundering and all the other not foreign policy related issues on how to monitor and ensure firms are complying with international and national law. So, I think there was a question on this side from a lady. No, okay. So then, over there in the.
Dr. Arnold, thank you for your time. Also a student at SICE currently. I guess my question, I guess it's like a hypothetical. So let's say you want to do a targeted sanction 311 on a Russian oligarch who has a manufacturing plant, an aluminum plant in Russia, and then also has a smelting plant, let's say in Ireland. And impose a 311 sanction on him, is there any way for him to buffer, is there any way for him to buffer any of the economic sanctions by maybe like before he knows maybe if he knew he was getting on the STN list to maybe do a swap or something, like short aluminum market or future or something like that? Is that ever, are they ever privy enough to the information that they know they're about to get an STN list, and is that a problem possibly for you to help maximize the effectiveness of
So broadly speaking, I would say yes, that is a policy concern, and again, that's touches on what I was saying earlier about this institutional arms race that is occurring between the sanctioning technology versus the anti-sanctions shielding technology, right? Both sides are trying to one up the other in terms of either strengthening and sharpening the effect versus blunting and mitigating the effect. And I think the case of Rusal is actually quite instructive in that the ownership changes that were made by Deripaska to divest ownership of these various assets that he controlled to under the 50% rule and so on was sufficient to have those companies be effectively delisted from the sanctions blacklist. So yeah, I think things have been becoming, again, I'll say there's, even as sanctions have become more sophisticated, counter-sanctions technology is also becoming more sophisticated. Yeah, there will need to be continued investment into the capacity, and dare I say, economic and statistical capacity of the US government to properly continue to maintain the efficacy of these tools. I think I seem to remember that there was some proposed legislation on Congress, before Congress, that suggested creating a statistical arm of Treasury OFAC that will do the kinds of simulations and statistical analysis and maybe machine learning and all that stuff that I talked about here to again maintain that administrative edge. So we'll see where that goes.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Thanks for your research, Dr. I'm a recent graduate of the Institute here. You mentioned the two data sets that you're working off of to understand the firms, particularly in a state like Russia where a lot of the firms and the ownership is obscured or controlled through networks that are not apparent ownership. I'm wondering if you could comment on your future research that you highlighted of how you intend to investigate or gather the evidence for some of these black market transactions that really fuel a big part of the Russian economy, and particularly in some of the front organizations or shell companies that you mentioned. How do you intend to gather that data and investigate where those subsidiaries and ownership links actually are?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And again, this second part, if you will, of the project is still a work in progress. We want to actually tie this off first before really shifting our gears toward the second one, but I can already tell you kind of anecdotally that it's been interesting to watch the growth of the ownership tree just spiral into this massive structure that funnels through, Panama and Cyprus and Finland and all that stuff in an effort to obscure their ownership. And again, that's sort of why I tied it back into that broader policy around tax evasion and AML and all of that. We need to maintain good policies on having transparency and ownership and all that stuff. That is a key element to why these targeted sanctions will continue to work. So, that is a key element to ensuring that these tools continue to work. Now, the data, for what it's worth, the data set that we gather, that we use, does go beyond just simply tracking the same firm. If the firm decides to change names or change ownership structures or something like that, the data puts a unique identification code onto the asset, and theoretically will continue to track that asset even through these ways of trying to, again, disguise ownership and all that stuff. So, but at the end of the day, this is Russia we're talking about. I think there's always going to be limitations to what data they can be, and in fact, this gets back to what we were saying earlier about anti-sanctions technology. Believe it or not, but I was just informed by one of my friends that Russia has introduced a law requiring firms to obscure their ownership structures in an effort to, again, protect them from the full fury of sanctions. So it's like an anti-transparency policy. So again, this and as an economist and as a data scientist, we live and die by our data, right? So maintaining transparency, maintaining clear pictures into what's actually happening in these economies. It's not a coincidence that we used Russia as our case study, not only because, again, it's a nice natural experiment because it's a purely targeted sanctions program, but also because it is a fairly prosperous medium income economy that actually has some reasonably credible data on inside it. Compare that with, say, North Korea, for example. I have a different project where I'm trying to study the economic impact of sanctions on North Korea. There we have to get very creative and use other kinds of data like geospatial imagery data to try and understand the impact. We can't really, there's no firm or individual level data that at least I'm aware of accessible on North Korea. So,
Thank you.
yes, I think there's a question here, and we're almost out of time. So, last question.
Well, first, when you said the law that was passed, it reminds me, I read in the Moscow Times, I think last month, they passed a law that said it would allow for, the word the Moscow Times quoted was unavoidable bribes. So that's just the nature of the Russian regime. But one, it would be interesting.
There's a famous joke about the best birthday gift being a stop sign, so that you can just stop random cars and ask them for a bribe. Sorry.
So it'd be interesting if, talking to your former colleagues at State, if they could do some sort of analysis based off of the data that you looked at and the classified annex to CATSA with the oligarchs list to actually see the impact for ownership on that end and try to understand, what are the most efficient targets to really go after. But when I was a student at Hopkins, I studied firm resilience to sanctions, and I'm curious, in your data that you looked at, was there just entire firm drop-off that led to less revenue, or were firms going to different export markets and perhaps discounting goods and services that led to that drop-off?
First of all, on your first point, thank you for that comment. Again, that's why I would make the case before the public and before Congress to properly devote resources, whether it's at the State Department, at the Treasury Department, White House, wherever, to think through the more complexities and nuances, because the data is out there. The data is out there, but we need the bandwidth and we need the resources and we need the right kinds of skill sets to actually draw actionable insights from that data. And again, I would argue, speaking as a data scientist, that there are all these now powerful tools in machine learning and all that stuff that can help us with this, but again, it needs that strategic vision. So, on your point around confirm resilience, so I don't have it in this presentation, but we tried to see whether the impact of sanctions was changing over time. we only have so the data is annual, and we only have a couple of years since the sanctions began. So we don't, we effectively only have around 4 to 5-ish years worth of data. So it's a little, I would say, too early to tell. But as far as the data goes, what does seem to be happening is there's a decline in the firm performance on average from the sanctions, and there isn't a recovery afterward. There isn't a continued decline. It's sort of the year after they get sanctioned, they see a decline, and then sort of stays there onwards. So limited evidence, therefore, that this sanctions fatigue that some people are talking about isn't quite an issue yet, but we'll see. We'll see as we get more data. All right, I think I'm out of time, but thank you very much again for listening. Thank you to those who drove 8 hours all the way just to listen to me talk. I hope this was interesting, and happy to just chat and answer more questions offline. Thank you very much.